On the 22nd of April, 1915, as twilight descended over the Belgian town of Ypres, French colonial soldiers from Algeria noticed something peculiar drifting across no man's land, a greenish-yellow cloud, thick as morning fog, rolling toward their trenches with unnatural purpose. Within minutes, men who had survived months of artillery bombardment began clawing at their throats, their lungs dissolving from the inside. The Great War had just crossed a threshold from which humanity could never return. The opening months of 1915 found Europe locked in a stalemate that mocked every pre-war prediction. Generals who had promised their nations victory by Christmas of 1914 now commanded armies frozen in muddy trenches stretching from the English Channel to the Swiss border. The Western Front had become a graveyard of 19th-century military doctrine, where cavalry charges shattered against machine gun fire and artillery barrages that could be heard in London failed to break defensive lines that simply regenerated like scar tissue. In Berlin, the German High Command faced a strategic nightmare. Der Schleifen planned the elegant military theory that would deliver swift victory through Belgium and into France had collapsed at the Marne. Now Germany fought a two-front war it could not sustain, against France and Britain in the west, Russia in the east. The Allied naval blockade strangled German ports, creating food shortages that would eventually claim hundreds of thousands of civilian lives. Kanselier Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg watched his nation's resources hemorrhage. While the casualty lists grew incomprehensible, something radical had to shift the balance. That something resided in the brilliant, tortured mind of Fritz Haber, a Jewish German chemist who would become one of history's most paradoxical figures. Before the war, Haber had revolutionized agriculture by synthesizing ammonia from atmospheric nitrogen, a discovery that would eventually feed billions, according to historian Dr. Margit Schlesigens. In her comprehensive biography, Haber believed his wartime chemical research represented patriotic duty, a way to end the slaughter quickly by breaking the stalemate. He could not have been more tragically wrong. Haber directed his genius toward weaponizing chlorine gas, creating a terror weapon that violated the Hague Convention of 1899, which Germany had signed. The German military establishment initially resisted not from moral scruple, but from doubt about effectiveness. Haber convinced them with demonstrations that showed chlorine's devastating potential. Heavier than air, it would sink into trenches where men sheltered. Invisible until too late, it would create panic that high explosives could not match. Field Marshal Erich von Falkenhayn, chief of the German General Staff, authorized its use despite international law. The Kaiser himself approved, rationalizing that the Allies had already bent the rules of civilized warfare. The target sector at Ypres was defended primarily by French colonial troops, Algerians, and territorial divisions considered expendable by French command. These men occupied poorly fortified positions in a salient, a bulge in the Allied lines that German forces surrounded on three sides. The British Expeditionary Force held positions to their right, Canadian divisions to their north. None had been issued gas masks because such equipment did not yet exist in meaningful quantities. The Allies had received intelligence warnings about German gas preparations from deserters and prisoners, but senior commanders dismissed these reports as enemy disinformation or the fantasies of frightened men. As April progressed, German pioneers installed thousands of cylinders containing 168 tons of liquefied chlorine along a 4-mile front opposite the French positions. They waited for favorable wind conditions, a steady breeze blowing toward Allied lines. The weather proved uncooperative for weeks, creating agonizing delays while soldiers on both sides existed in mounting tension, aware that something unprecedented approached but unable to imagine its true horror. When meteorological conditions finally aligned on that late April afternoon, German engineers opened 6,000 cylinders simultaneously. The chlorine vaporized immediately upon release, forming a cloud 30 feet high that advanced at walking speed toward the French trenches. Soldiers in the rear echelons initially thought they were observing smoke from artillery shells, a common enough sight. Those in forward positions realized their mistake within seconds. Chlorine gas attacks the mucous membranes of the eyes, nose, throat, and lungs. At sufficient concentration, it reacts with moisture to form hydrochloric acid, effectively drowning victims in the fluid their own bodies produce defensively. Men caught in the initial wave experienced sensations beyond the vocabulary of existing warfare: burning eyes, convulsive coughing, the feeling of suffocation while still breathing. Some died standing upright, frozen in their last moments of agony. Others fled in blind panic, spreading chaos through the rear areas and creating a gap for miles wide in the Allied line. The Algerian and territorial divisions simply ceased to exist as fighting formations. Approximately 10,000 men were casualties within 10 minutes, with estimates of 5,000 deaths in the immediate aftermath. According to military records housed at the Imperial War Museum, survivors staggered rearward, vomiting blood, their faces tinged blue-green by the poison. Many who initially survived would die agonizing deaths over the following days, as their damaged lungs filled with fluid or became infected. The psychological trauma proved equally devastating. Men who recovered physically often never returned to combat effectiveness, haunted by the memory of invisible death. German infantry, equipped with primitive respiratory pads soaked in sodium thiosulfate solution, advanced cautiously behind the gas cloud. They encountered scenes that shocked even veterans hardened by months of industrial slaughter. Trenches filled with bodies contorted in final agonies, artillery pieces abandoned, rifles scattered across the ground. The Germans had achieved complete tactical surprise and opened a gap that, properly exploited, might have reached the Channel coast and split the Allied armies. But the attackers had not anticipated their own success. German commanders had viewed the gas attack as an experiment, not the main offensive effort. They had insufficient reserves positioned to exploit the breakthrough. Moreover, the gas remained hazardous to their own advancing troops. German soldiers became casualties from residual chlorine in trenches and shell craters. The attack stalled not from Allied resistance, which had effectively evaporated, but from German hesitation and inadequate planning. Into this catastrophic breach stepped the Canadian 1st Division, holding positions adjacent to the shattered French line. Commanded by Lieutenant General Edwin Alderson, these colonial troops faced an impossible situation. German forces now threatened to envelop their position from the exposed flank. Retreat would mean abandoning Ypres and potentially unraveling the entire Allied position in Belgium. The Canadians had to hold against overwhelming odds, using the same inadequate weapons that had failed the French. The Canadian response became legendary in their national mythologic defining moment when colonial troops proved their worth in the eyes of an empire that had often treated them as second-tier forces. Without gas masks or protective equipment, Canadian soldiers improvised frantically. Officers ordered men to urinate on cloth handkerchiefs and hold them over their faces, a crude but marginally effective filter based on ammonia's chemical properties. This improvisation, born from desperation, would be repeated by other Allied forces in subsequent attacks. Throughout the night of April 22nd and into the next day, Canadian and British reinforcements launched counterattacks into the gap. These assaults occurred in confusion and darkness, with units often firing on each other and objectives impossible to identify in the chaos. The Germans, meanwhile, launched a second gas attack on April 24th, this time targeting Canadian positions directly. Once again, the poisonous cloud rolled across no man's land, and once again, men died choking on their own dissolving lungs. The Second Battle of Ypres, as historians would name this horror, continued until May 25th, 1915, transforming from a gas attack into a grinding attritional struggle. The initial chemical assault had achieved tactical surprise, but strategic failure the Allies held Ypres, though at catastrophic cost. The true significance extended far beyond tactical considerations. Germany had legitimized a new category of warfare, and the other combatants would respond in kind, initiating an arms race in suffering. French chemists and military planners immediately began developing their own gas weapons. Britain, initially morally outraged, soon followed suit, establishing a dedicated chemical warfare service under the direction of scientists who would create ever more lethal compounds. The war had already industrialized killing through machine guns, artillery, and barbed wire. Chemical weapons represented the next logical step in applying scientific method to mass death warfare as chemistry problem. Soldiers as experimental subjects. The human cost at Ypres defied comprehension even by Great War standards. Allied casualties for the battle totaled approximately 70,000 men killed, wounded, or missing. German losses approached 35,000. These figures, clinical and abstract, concealed individual tragedies beyond counting. In hospitals throughout Belgium and France, doctors confronted injuries unlike anything in medical literature. Gas victims presented symptoms that mimicked drowning, burning, and asphyxiation simultaneously. Many survivors suffered permanent lung damage, blindness, or psychological conditions that 1915 medicine could neither understand nor treat effectively. The gas attacks also revealed deep fissures in Allied command structure and national priorities. French generals quietly blamed their colonial troops for the initial breakthrough, ignoring the fact that no formation could have withstood the surprise gas attack. British commanders privately questioned French competence and commitment. These tensions, papered over by diplomatic necessity, would fester throughout the war and contribute to catastrophic failures in later offensives. The Dominion vs. Canadian, Australian, New Zealander increasingly doubted the British High Command's tactical competence, while simultaneously proving their own battlefield effectiveness at horrific cost. Fritz Haber received Germany's highest military decoration for his contribution to the gas program. His wife, Clara Imauer, also a chemist and one of the first women to earn a doctorate in Germany, despaired at her husband's transformation from life-giving scientist to architect of mass poisoning. On the night of May 2nd, 1915, just days after the second Ypres gas attack, Clara Imauer shot herself in the heart with her husband's military pistol in their garden. She left no note, but colleagues and family understood her suicide as both personal and political statement, a rejection of the perversion of science into industrialized murder. Haber, grief-stricken but unwavering in his conviction that chemical warfare would shorten the conflict, continued developing new agents. His team created phosgene 12 times more lethal than chlorine. Later would come mustard gas, which blistered skin, blinded victims, and caused agonizing deaths that could take weeks. Each innovation prompted Allied countermeasures and retaliatory chemical weapons. By war's end, both sides had deployed dozens of chemical agents, causing over 1 million casualties, with approximately 90,000 deaths, according to research compiled by the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. The psychological impact extended beyond direct exposure. Soldiers throughout the Western Front now lived with additional not just bullets, shells, and bayonets, but invisible poisons that could arrive without warning, carried on wind, sinking into trenches during night watches. Gas masks became standard issue, transforming soldiers into insectoid figures whose muffled breathing provided soundtrack to the industrialized apocalypse. The masks themselves caused claustrophobia, limited visibility, and created communication difficulties that contributed to battlefield confusion and friendly fire incidents. Civilians in the combatant nations read newspaper accounts sanitized of the worst details, but returning wounded told stories that newspapers could not print. The normalization of chemical warfare at Ypres opened a door that subsequent generations would struggle desperately to close. Within months of the initial attacks, gas became routine on the Western Front, no longer an experimental terror weapon but standard military procedure. Commanders scheduled gas bombardments with the same bureaucratic efficiency they applied to artillery preparation. Soldiers learned to recognize the warning signals. Sentries ringing bells or beating on shell casings. The telltale ground-hugging mist. The sharp scent that varied by agent. This adaptation represented humanity's remarkable capacity to normalize the abnormal, to make horror routine through repetition. The immediate aftermath of Second Ypres forced rapid evolution in defensive technology. British, French, and later American forces developed increasingly sophisticated gas masks, from crude cloth pads to complex respirators with replaceable filters and eye protection. Chemical warfare research facilities expanded exponentially. By 1918, every major combatant operated secret laboratories where scientists tested new agents on animals and, occasionally, on volunteers for military prisons. The same scientific community that had promised progress and enlightenment through rational inquiry now applied its methods to discovering the most efficient ways to poison human beings. Germany's decision to weaponize chemistry backfired strategically in ways the General Staff never anticipated. International opinion, already skeptical of German claims to represent European civilization after the invasion of neutral Belgium, solidified against the Central Powers. American newspapers, serving a nation still officially neutral in 1915, published graphic accounts of gas casualties that influenced public sentiment away from Germany. President Woodrow Wilson, maintaining America's non-belligerent status while the nation's sympathies and economic interests aligned increasingly with the Allies, privately expressed revulsion at German methods. The gas attacks contributed to the moral framework that would eventually justify American entry into the war in 1917. For the soldiers who survived gas exposure, the war never truly ended. Thousands returned home with permanently damaged respiratory systems, prone to pneumonia and bronchitis. Their life expectancies dramatically shortened. Others lost their sight partially or completely, joining the ranks of blinded veterans who became living reminders of war's costs throughout the 1920s and 30s. The psychological scars proved equally permanent. Gas survivors experienced what contemporaries called shell shock, and later generations would recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, triggered by scents, by fog, by any sensation that recalled the choking helplessness of poison clouds. The Haber family tragedy continued to unfold across the 20th century. Fritz Haber, despite his contributions to German victory efforts, faced increasing persecution as the Nazi regime came to power in the 19th. His Jewish heritage, previously overlooked due to his scientific prestige and wartime service, became fatal liability under racial laws. Haber fled Germany in 1933, dying in exile in Switzerland the following year, broken by his nation's rejection and haunted by his wife's suicide. Grotesquely, the Zyklon B gas, used in Nazi extermination camps, descended directly from pesticides Haber's institute had developed. The scientist who had argued that poison gas would save lives by shortening war had instead helped create the technology that enabled industrial genocide. International attempts to ban chemical weapons began immediately after the war. The 1925 Geneva Protocol prohibited the use of chemical and biological weapons in warfare. 140 nations eventually signed, but critical loopholes remained. The protocol banned use but not production or stockpiling, allowing nations to maintain massive chemical arsenals as deterrents. Moreover, enforcement mechanisms were essentially non-existent. Iraq used chemical weapons against Iran and Kurdish civilians in the 1980s. Syrian government forces deployed sarin gas against civilians in 2013. The door opened at Ypres in 1915 had never fully closed. The Canadian sacrifice at Ypres became foundational to national identity, commemorated annually and taught to school children as proof of Canadian military prowess and moral character. This mythology obscured uncomfortable truths about colonial hierarchies and the expendability of troops from the Dominions. The 20th century would repeatedly return to the lessons unlearned from Ypres. During the interwar period, major powers continued chemical weapons research despite the Geneva Protocol. Britain used tear gas and other chemical agents to suppress colonial rebellions in Iraq and elsewhere, creating precedent that civilized rules of warfare applied only between European powers, not in colonial enforcement. Italy employed mustard gas against Ethiopian forces during Mussolini's invasion of 1935 and 1936, demonstrating that international law meant little without enforcement mechanisms or genuine moral commitment from powerful nations. The Second World War, despite its unprecedented scale and brutality, saw relatively limited chemical weapon deployment between major combatants, not from ethical evolution, but from mutual deterrence and fear of retaliation. Both Allied and Axis powers maintained massive chemical stockpiles. Hitler, himself a gas casualty at Ypres in October 19, reportedly resisted using chemical weapons on the battlefield, though this restraint notably did not extend to genocide. The technology perfected by Fritz Haber's successors found its most horrific application, not in military combat, but in the systematic murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others deemed undesirable by Nazi ideology. Post-war chemical weapons development accelerated during the Cold War. The United States and Soviet Union created arsenals capable of killing every human on Earth multiple times over. Nerve agents like VX and sarin, far deadlier than World War I gases, were produced in industrial quantities. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction that governed nuclear strategy applied equally to chemical weapons. Massive stockpiles maintained as deterrents, their use restrained only by fear of equivalent retaliation. The international community's failure to truly abolish chemical weapons after Ypres had created a world where entire populations lived under threat of invisible, agonizing death. The 1997 Chemical Weapons Convention represented humanity's most serious attempt to eliminate these weapons. Unlike the Geneva Protocol, it prohibited development, production, stockpiling, and use, with verification measures and inspection regimes. 193 nations have joined, and declared stockpiles have been substantially destroyed, yet compliance remains imperfect. Syria's use of chemical weapons in its civil war proved that even in the 21st century, some actors will deploy these weapons when they calculate the international response will be manageable. Modern military forces train extensively for chemical warfare scenarios, maintaining defensive capabilities even as offensive programs officially end. Gas masks remain standard equipment. Decontamination procedures form part of basic training. Soldiers study the same lessons learned so painfully at Ypres more than a century ago. Importance of rapid detection, immediate protective measures, and medical treatment protocols. The shadow cast by that April day in 1915 extends across military doctrine worldwide. The environmental legacy of chemical weapons persists literally in the soil of Europe. Unexploded chemical munitions from the Great War continued to surface during construction and farming operations in Belgium and France. These iron harvests require specialized disposal by military units equipped to handle centriold, but still lethal chemical agents. Thousands of tons of chemical weapons were simply dumped in oceans after both world wars, creating time bombs on the seafloor, where corroding containers will eventually release their contents into marine ecosystems. The Ypres gas attacks ultimately exemplify how technological capability divorced from ethical restraint creates horrors that echo across generations. Fritz Haber genuinely believed his work would save lives by ending the war quickly. German military commanders convinced themselves that chemical weapons represented legitimate military innovation no different from previous advances in lethality. Both rationalized atrocity through appeals to national necessity and professional duty. The result was not shortened war, but expanded suffering, a template for 20th century conflicts where technological sophistication served moral regression. Today, the battlefields around Ypres are peaceful farmland and memorial parks. The Menin Gate Memorial lists 54,000 British Empire soldiers with no known graves. Chemical weapons casualties are not separately marked. They died as all the others died, serving nations that sent them to industrialized slaughter. Their story reminds us that civilization's veneer proves desperately thin when fear and nationalism overwhelm basic human decency.